Hello, guys, welcome to Biology Made Easy. My name is Miss Natasha, and I'm going to take you through today's topic. So, today we're going to look at gaseous exchange in humans. So, basically, we're going to look at how oxygen gets into the human body and how carbon dioxide gets out of the human body. So, without wasting any time, let's jump right into it. Oxygen is very essential to human beings. So it is directly obtained from the air and it is used during respiration to release energy. So during the process of respiration, carbohydrates are broken down using oxygen to release energy. And besides the energy, carbon dioxide is also released as a waste product. And since carbon dioxide is a waste product, it has to be removed from an organism. So the human body is adapted to take in oxygen and to remove carbon dioxide, and this process is known as gaseous exchange. So the human gaseous exchange system or the human respiratory system is adapted to ensure that gaseous exchange takes place efficiently. This diagram shows us the structure of the human respiratory system. So we can see the larynx. The larynx is also known as the voice box, and just below the larynx we can see the trachea. The trachea is surrounded by rings of cartilage, and these rings of cartilage support the trachea. They help to keep the trachea open. So the trachea divides into two branches which are known as bronchi. So it divides into the left bronchus and into the right bronchus. So these bronchi enter the lungs, and inside the lungs, the bronchi divide into smaller and smaller branches which are known as bronchioles. And at the end of each bronchiole, there are alveoli or air sacs. Each lung is surrounded by pleural membranes and pleural fluid. So the pleural membranes and the pleural fluid help to protect the lung. So we can also see the diaphragm, which is dome-shaped, and we can also see the ribs, and in between the ribs there are muscles. So there is the internal intercostal muscle and the external intercostal muscle. So this is what the respiratory system looks like. So the mouth and the nose are also part of the respiratory system. So the main organs of the respiratory system are the mouth and nose, the larynx, trachea, bronchi and bronchioles, the alveoli, the diaphragm, the ribs, and the intercostal muscles. The air can enter the body through the nose and mouth, and inside the nose there are small hairs and mucus which trap dust particles when you breathe in. So basically the nose allows the air to become warm, moist, and filtered before it enters the lungs. From the mouth and nose, the air enters the trachea. At the top of the trachea there is a piece of cartilage that is known as the epiglottis. So the epiglottis closes the trachea when you swallow food, and this stops food from entering the trachea. And below the epiglottis there is the voice box or the larynx. So inside the voice box there are vocal cords, and vocal cords produce sound when air passes through them. So the main function of the larynx is to produce sound. The trachea also has rings of cartilage, and these rings of cartilage help to keep the trachea open. The trachea goes down through the neck into the thorax, and the thorax is the upper part of your body from the neck down to the bottom of the ribs and the diaphragm. And in the thorax, the trachea divides into two branches that are called the right and the left bronchi. So one is called a bronchus. So one bronchus goes into each lung and then branches into smaller and smaller tubes that are called bronchioles. So the main function of the bronchi and the bronchioles is to conduct air to and from the alveoli and to filter out dirt and other harmful substances from the air. So inside the walls of the bronchi, there are tiny hair-like projections that are called cilia. And on top of the cilia, there is mucus. So mucus traps bacteria, dust particles, and other harmful substances from air. And then the cilia moves or sweeps the mucus towards the mouth so that it can be removed from the lungs. This diagram shows us part of the lining of the respiratory passages, and the respiratory passages are the bronchi and the bronchioles. So inside the walls of the respiratory passages, we have ciliated cells and goblet cells. Ciliated cells have projections on top of them which are known as cilia, and goblet cells produce mucus. So the mucus traps dust particles and other harmful substances from the air, and the cilia beats in order to move or to sweep the mucus away from the lungs towards the mouth. So the main function of the cilia and the mucus is to trap the dust particles and harmful substances and to sweep those harmful substances towards the mouth so that they can be removed from the lungs. The alveoli are found at the end of each bronchiole, so they are tiny air spaces or tiny air sacs, and this is where gaseous exchange takes place. So in this diagram, we can see the alveoli. So this is a bronchiole, and at the end of each bronchiole, there are tiny air sacs which are known as alveoli. So the alveoli are surrounded by blood vessels which are known as capillaries. So the blood vessels bring blood without oxygen from the pulmonary arteries, and then this blood gets oxygen from the alveoli, and then the capillaries then carry blood containing oxygen from the alveoli. So gaseous exchange takes place in the alveoli. I mentioned in the previous slide that gaseous exchange occurs through the walls of the alveoli, and that capillaries are closely wrapped around the alveoli. So oxygen diffuses across the walls of the alveoli into the blood in the capillaries, and then carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli. This diagram illustrates how gaseous exchange occurs in the alveoli. So this is an alveolus, and this is a blood capillary. So the blood capillary brings deoxygenated blood or blood containing carbon dioxide to the alveolus. So the carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood inside the capillaries into the alveolus. And at the same time, oxygen diffuses from the alveolus into the blood inside the capillaries. And then the blood inside the capillaries containing oxygen is then carried away from the alveolus. And air is constantly moving in and out of the alveolus. So basically, air moves in, and the air contains oxygen. And oxygen diffuses into the blood inside the capillaries, and it is carried away from the alveolus. And then blood which contains carbon dioxide or deoxygenated blood is then carried to the alveolus, and then the carbon dioxide diffuses into the alveolus, and then air moves out of the alveolus. The alveoli have several special features which make gaseous exchange efficient. So the walls of the alveoli are very thin. They are only 1 cell thick, and the walls of the capillaries are also 1 cell thick. So this makes the diffusion of oxygen into the capillaries easy because of the short diffusion distance from the alveoli into the blood capillaries. The alveoli are also well vascularized, and this means that they have a lot of capillaries wrapped around them. This means that the capillaries are close enough so that oxygen can diffuse into the blood and carbon dioxide can diffuse into the alveoli. So the alveoli also have a large surface area. There are a lot of alveoli inside the lungs. The total surface area of all the alveoli is over 100 square meters, and that is a very large surface area. And lastly, the alveoli have a good supply of oxygen because air is constantly moving in and out of the alveoli. The surface area where gaseous exchange takes place has to be thin in order to allow the gases to diffuse across them quickly. And also the area of gaseous exchange has to be close to an efficient transport system to take gases to and from the exchange surface. This means that the area of gaseous exchange has to be well vascularized. The area of gaseous exchange should have a large surface area so that a lot of gases can diffuse across at the same time. And the area of gaseous exchange should have a good supply of oxygen. The alveoli have got all these properties, and this makes gaseous exchange efficient. To move air in and out of the lungs, you must keep changing the volume of your thorax. First, you make it so large that air can be sucked in, and then you make it small again so that air can be squeezed out. So this is called breathing. The ribs, intercostal muscles, and diaphragm help in breathing. In this diagram, we can see the structure of part of the thorax. So these are the lungs, and they are found inside the rib cage, and these are the ribs. And in between the ribs we can see the intercostal muscles. So this is the internal intercostal muscle, and this is the external intercostal muscle. So the intercostal muscles, the diaphragm, which is found just below the ribs, and the ribs help in breathing. When breathing in or during inspiration, the muscles of the diaphragm contract. So this pulls the diaphragm downwards, which increases the volume of the thorax. And at the same time, the external intercostal muscles contract, and these pull the rib cage upwards and outwards. And this also increases the volume of the thorax. So when you breathe in, the diaphragm contracts and it goes downwards. And at the same time, the external intercostal muscles contract and they pull the rib cage upwards and outwards. And all this increases the volume of the thorax. As the volume of the thorax increases, the pressure inside it falls below atmospheric pressure. This means that there is extra space. So something has to occupy that space. Therefore, air rushes in along the trachea and the bronchi into the lungs. So when you breathe in, the diaphragm contracts and it goes downwards. At the same time, the external intercostal muscles contract and they pull the rib cage upwards and outwards. All this increases the volume of the thorax. So inside the thorax, the pressure falls below atmospheric pressure, and then air rushes in along the trachea and the bronchi into the lungs. When you breathe out or during expiration, the muscles of the diaphragm relax. This means that the diaphragm springs back up into its dome shape, and this reduces the volume of the thorax. And at the same time, the rib cage drops down again into its normal position, and this also reduces the volume of the thorax. So the reduction in volume in the thorax forces air out of the lungs through the trachea. So when you breathe out, the muscles of the diaphragm relax, and the diaphragm springs back up into its dome shape. And at the same time, the rib cage drops down into its normal position. All this reduces the volume of the thorax, and the reduction in volume forces air to move out of the lungs through the trachea. This diagram illustrates what I was trying to explain. So when you breathe in or during inspiration, the diaphragm contracts, and when it contracts, it is lowered. And at the same time, the intercostal muscles, which are found in between the ribs, contract. And when the intercostal muscles contract, they push the rib cage upwards and outwards. And this increases the volume of the thorax. And when the volume of the thorax increases, air is drawn into the lungs. And when you breathe out, the diaphragm relaxes, so it springs back up into its normal position. And at the same time, the intercostal muscles relax, so the rib cage is lowered. The volume of the thorax decreases, and then air is forced out of the lungs. So first, during inspiration, the diaphragm is lowered, the rib cage is raised, the volume of the thorax increases, so air is drawn into the lungs. And during expiration, the diaphragm springs back upwards, the rib cage is lowered, the volume of the thorax decreases, so air is forced out of the lungs. Gaseous exchange is different from breathing. So gaseous exchange is the process whereby gases are exchanged across a respiratory surface. For example, oxygen diffuses into the blood and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood inside the alveoli. And then when you breathe, basically you are supplying the respiratory surface with air. And during breathing, there are muscular movements which keep the respiratory surface supplied with oxygen. The air you breathe in and the air you breathe out is very different. So the air you breathe in has got a lot of oxygen. It is usually dry and the temperature is usually low. And then the air you breathe out has got a lot of carbon dioxide. The water content is usually high, and then it is always warm. So in inspired air, there is 21% oxygen, 0.04% carbon dioxide, 1% argon and other noble gases. The water content is variable and the temperature is also variable. And in expired air, there is 16% oxygen, there is 4% carbon dioxide, 1% argon and other noble gases. The water content is always high and the temperature is always high. In inspired air, there is 21% oxygen, and in expired air, there is 16% oxygen. This is because oxygen is absorbed across the gas exchange surface, then it is used by cells in respiration. In inspired air, there is 0.04% carbon dioxide, and then in expired air, there is 4% carbon dioxide. This is because carbon dioxide is made inside the respiring cells, and then it diffuses out across the gas exchange surface. The concentration of argon and other noble gases in inspired air is the same as in expired air. This is because these gases are neither produced nor used by the body. And then the water content in inspired air is variable, whilst the water content in expired air is always high. This is because the gas exchange surfaces are made of living cells, so they must be kept moist, and some of this moisture evaporates into the air. Then the temperature of the expired air is always warm, whilst the temperature of the inspired air is variable. This is because the air is warmed as it passes through the respiratory passages. So all the cells in the body need oxygen, and all this oxygen is supplied by the lungs. So the oxygen is carried by the blood to every part of the body. So when you are running or exercising, the body and the muscles require more oxygen for all that work. So in order to get more oxygen in the blood, you breathe deeper and faster. The heart also beats faster in order to get oxygen to the muscles quicker. So exercising or running increases the breathing rate, and it also increases the heart rate. Smoking is very dangerous. It affects the body negatively. It mainly affects the lungs and the heart. Cigarette smoke contains nicotine, tar, carcinogens, and carbon monoxide. It also contains many other toxins. So nicotine is addictive and it also affects the circulatory system, so it causes heart problems. And then tar blocks the bronchioles and it causes bronchitis. Carcinogens cause cancer, and carbon monoxide binds permanently to hemoglobin. So hemoglobin is the red pigment in blood which carries oxygen around the body. So when carbon monoxide binds to hemoglobin, it means that oxygen can no longer bind to hemoglobin, and this affects the body in a negative way. So the short-term effects of smoking are destruction of alveoli, increased mucus production, and constriction of the bronchioles. And the long-term effects of smoking are cancer, bronchitis, and heart disease. We have come to the end of our session, so thank you guys for watching until the end.